I'm Hazel Patterson, 38, and I'll never forget last Christmas when my world shifted. We were all gathered at my parents' home in Boston when my 2-year-old daughter, Grace, proudly handed her handmade gift to my younger brother, Richard. He examined it, sneered, and loudly proclaimed, "Cheap, worthless trash." The room froze as Grace ran away sobbing. Richard's face held that familiar smirk. He was enjoying this. In that moment, watching my daughter's tears, something inside me finally snapped. This wasn't just another cruel moment from Richard. This was the beginning of the end for his reign of terror in our family. Before I dive into what happened next, where are you watching from today? Hit like and subscribe if you've ever had to protect someone you love from a toxic family member. Trust me, what unfolded after that Christmas moment will show you exactly why sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand up to your own blood. The truth is, what happened that Christmas wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the most recent chapter in a lifelong pattern of Richard's cruelty and my family's willingness to enable it. Richard is 2 years younger than me, but for as long as I can remember, he's been the golden child in our family. Our parents, Thomas and Margaret Patterson, never bothered hiding their preference. While I worked hard for every scrap of approval, Richard simply existed and received endless praise. I still remember my 10th birthday when I won a school art competition. I couldn't wait to show my parents the blue ribbon, but when I got home, they were fawning over Richard's C+ math test. "He's really improving," my father had said proudly. My ribbon was glanced at briefly before being placed on the refrigerator, where Richard's test covered half of it by dinner time. It wasn't just neglect. Richard actively sabotaged me. When I was 14, I spent weeks creating a science project about marine ecosystems. The night before the fair, I found it destroyed in the garage, fish specimens spoiled and display boards soaked. Richard claimed he'd accidentally knocked it over while getting his bike. My parents told me I should have been more careful about where I put it. By 16, I'd given up seeking their approval. I buried myself in art and design, finding validation outside my home. My high school art teacher, Mrs. Daniels, became the mentor my parents never were. She helped me apply to college programs, celebrated my achievements, and provided the encouragement my family withheld. I married young, too young looking back. James seemed like my ticket out of Boston and away from my family's dynamics. We moved to Chicago, had Grace when I was 26, and for a while I thought I'd escaped. But the marriage collapsed under the weight of James's ambition and my unresolved family trauma. 5 years ago, after the divorce, I made the difficult decision to return to Boston. Grace needed stability, and despite everything, I wanted her to know her grandparents. Since returning, Richard's success at my father's investment firm has been constantly compared to my modest career as a freelance graphic designer. Every family dinner features subtle reminders that Richard manages millions while I struggle to maintain consistent clients. What I didn't realize until recently was that Richard had shifted his target to Grace. After comforting her in the guest bedroom following the Christmas gift incident, she finally confessed, "He's been saying mean things to me for months, Mom." She described how Richard would pull her aside at family gatherings to criticize her clothes, her grades, even the way she spoke. "He told me, 'I'm just like you,'" Grace said quietly. "He said that's why Dad left." My hands shook as Grace recounted months of these quiet cruelties. Richard had been careful always when I wasn't within earshot, always with that plausible deniability that had protected him throughout childhood. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, brushing hair from her tear-stained face. "He said you had enough problems," Grace whispered, "and that no one would believe me anyway because everyone knows he's the successful one, and we're just burdens." Something hardened inside me hearing those words. My daughter had been carrying this pain alone because Richard had convinced her that no one would stand up for her. Just like no one had stood up for me. As we sat in that guest room, the sounds of continued Christmas celebrations drifting up from downstairs, I made a promise to myself and to Grace. This pattern that had damaged my childhood would not destroy hers. Richard's behavior wasn't just annoying family drama anymore, it was actively harming my child. And that was something I would not tolerate no matter what it cost me. We couldn't avoid the Christmas dinner that followed, though every instinct told me to take Grace and leave immediately. My mother had prepared her traditional feast roast beef Yorkshire pudding and all the fixings that normally would have made my mouth water. But as we took our seats at the ornate dining table, the food might as well have been cardboard. The tension was thick enough to slice with the carving knife my father was using on the roast. Grace sat beside me, her eyes downcast, pushing food around her plate. Across the table, Richard acted as if nothing had happened, laughing loudly at his own jokes, while his wife Jennifer smiled tensely beside him. "Grace, aren't you hungry?" my mother asked, frowning at my daughter's full plate. "I made those garlic potatoes you like." Before Grace could answer, Richard chimed in. "Maybe she's watching her figure. Getting a bit pudgy, isn't she?" I placed my fork down with deliberate slowness. "Don't talk about my daughter that way." "Just joking around," Richard said, winking at our father, who chuckled uncomfortably. "So sensitive these days, Hazel." My mother, ever the peacekeeper, jumped in. "Richard was just joking about the gift earlier, too. No need to make a scene." A scene, I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Grace spent weeks making that stained glass picture frame. She took a class specifically to learn how to make something special for her uncle. "And I appreciate the effort," Richard said with a smirk that suggested the opposite. "But really, what am I supposed to do with some amateur craft project? I have Murano glass pieces in my office." My father nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Richard meets with important clients, Hazel. Appearances matter in his position." "Position that you handed to him," I muttered, stabbing a potato. The table went silent. I'd broken an unspoken rule: never acknowledge Richard's success came through nepotism rather than merit. Richard's eyes narrowed. At least I made something of the opportunities I was given, instead of wasting my education on a dying field and begging for scraps of work. "I don't beg for work," I said through gritted teeth. "I have clients who value what I do." Richard laughed, looking around the table as if seeking allies for his amusement. "Is that why you asked Dad for a loan last month, for your thriving business?" I froze. The loan application had been confidential. A last resort after losing a major client had put me in a temporary financial bind. "How do you know about that?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Richard exchanged glances with our father. "Dad consults me on financial decisions." I advised against throwing good money after bad. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "You convinced him to reject my loan application," I turned to my father. "Is that true?" My father had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Richard pointed out that your business model isn't sustainable in the current economy. We agreed it would be enabling rather than helping." "Enabling?" I repeated, my voice hollow. "I needed that loan to upgrade my equipment to meet industry standards. I had a solid repayment plan." "A plan based on projected earnings that were wildly optimistic," Richard countered. "I was protecting Dad's investment." Something inside me snapped. Years of suppressed anger and hurt came flooding out. "You've been undermining me my entire life. Every achievement, every relationship, every opportunity, you've poisoned them all. And now you're doing the same thing to Grace." Richard's face hardened. "See what I mean?" He gestured around the table. "This is exactly the kind of unstable behavior I was warning you about. One business setback and she's creating conspiracy theories and making scenes at Christmas dinner." My mother reached for my arm. "Hazel, please. You're ruining Christmas. Richard was just looking out for your father's interests." He's been looking out for his interests since we were children, I shot back, pulling away from her touch. And you've both enabled him every step of the way. That's enough, my father said sharply. I won't have you accusing your brother of what I interrupted. Of being cruel, manipulative, selfish, all things you've excused his entire life. The table fell silent. Richard stared at me with cold hatred, no longer bothering to mask his contempt with charm. Grace and I are leaving, I announced, standing up. Thank you for dinner. You can't just walk away from family, my mother protested. I looked around at their faces, my father's anger, my mother's distress, Richard's calculating eyes. Family doesn't treat each other the way he's treated us. As Grace and I gathered our things, Richard followed us to the foyer. Away from our parents' ears, he hissed. You've always been jealous of me. Now you're turning your daughter against her family too. Pathetic. I met his gaze steadily. Stay away from my daughter. The drive home was quiet until Grace finally spoke. There's more, Mom. Things Uncle Richard has done that I didn't tell you. Over the next hour, Grace revealed how Richard had told cousins not to play with her because she was weird, how he'd shown her Facebook posts where my ex-husband was vacationing with his new girlfriend to upset her, and how he'd told her I was considering sending her to live with her father because I couldn't afford to raise her anymore, a complete fabrication that had caused her weeks of anxiety. Later that night, after Grace was asleep, I sat at my computer, anger burning like fuel. I began researching Richard's business dealings, his social media news mentions of him. What started as aimless rage slowly crystallized into determination. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting Grace from the psychological damage I'd endured growing up. As dawn broke, I made a decision. This ends now, I whispered to my reflection in the monitor's dark screen. Richard had spent a lifetime hiding behind a facade of charm and success. It was time to find out what else he might be hiding. January arrived with a bitter cold that matched my resolve. While Grace returned to school, I launched my own education, learning everything I could about Richard's business and personal affairs. My first lead came unexpectedly. While updating my LinkedIn profile to attract new design clients, I noticed a message from Sophia Lewis. The name seemed vaguely familiar, and reading her message explained why she had been Richard's executive assistant at Patterson Investment Group until 6 months ago. I saw your Hazel Patterson, her message read. I worked for your brother. I think we should talk. We met at a coffee shop far from the financial district. Sophia was in her early 30s, professionally dressed, despite no longer working for my brother's firm. The tension in her shoulders eased only after scanning the room to ensure no familiar faces were present. I was fired after filing a harassment complaint, she explained, stirring her untouched coffee. Your brother made my life hell for 2 years, but I needed the job. When I finally reported him, HR seemed sympathetic until Richard got involved. Suddenly, my performance was being questioned, my reports scrutinized. They let me go for unrelated reasons a week later. Did you take legal action? I asked. Sophia laughed bitterly. Against Patterson Investment Group, your father's lawyers made it clear what would happen if I tried. The severance package came with an NDA I couldn't afford not to sign. She wasn't the only one, she explained. Richard had a pattern with female employees, charm at first, then inappropriate comments, subtle touches, implied threats about career advancement. Those who played along received perks. Those who resisted faced obstacles. But what caught my attention was her offhand comment about client accounts. Richard would have me prepare 2 versions of certain portfolio reports, she said, lowering her voice. One for the clients and another for internal records. I always felt something was off about the numbers. This was something concrete, something beyond Richard's personality flaws. I asked Sophia if she had any documentation, but the NDA had required her to return everything. However, she gave me a name, James Wilson, a senior portfolio manager who had questioned some of Richard's investment strategies. James was harder to approach. As a current employee, he had much more to lose. It took 3 ignored emails and finally a handwritten note delivered to his home address before he agreed to meet me. "I shouldn't be talking to you," were his first words when we met in a park on a freezing February morning. "But things at the firm aren't right, and your father doesn't want to see it." James explained that Richard had been pushing increasingly aggressive investment strategies for certain client portfolios, ones that generated high management fees but exposed clients to substantial risks. More concerning were discrepancies in transaction records that James had noticed while covering for Richard during a vacation. "I brought it to your father's attention," James said. "He brushed it off as administrative errors and said Richard would handle it. The next week, my access to those accounts was restricted." James couldn't provide documentation either, but his concerns aligned with Sophia's observations. I needed hard evidence, which meant professional help. I found Diane Rodriguez through a women's business network. A former financial crimes investigator turned private detective. She didn't come cheap, but I was willing to max out my credit card if necessary. "Family cases are messy," Diane warned during our consultation. "Are you sure you want to do this?" "My brother has been hurting people his entire life," I replied. "Now he's hurting my daughter. I need to know what I'm dealing with." Over the next few weeks, Diane uncovered disturbing patterns. Richard maintained a lifestyle well beyond even his generous salary, a vacation house in Maine, a boat, luxury cars, expensive art. More tellingly, she found evidence of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands receiving regular transfers. Based on the timing and amounts, Diane explained, showing me a timeline she'd created these transfers correlate with major client investment activations at the firm. "I can't prove it without internal documents, but it looks like skimming." The implications were staggering. Richard wasn't just an emotionally abusive brother, he was potentially defrauding clients, including our father's oldest friends and business associates. As the evidence mounted, Grace began having nightmares. She'd wake up crying, worried that her uncle would somehow know what we were doing and hurt us. I questioned whether my pursuit of justice was worth the toll it was taking on her. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, I sat on the edge of Grace's bed, smoothing her hair as she calmed down. "Maybe we should stop," I suggested gently. "Move somewhere new, start fresh." Grace looked at me with surprising intensity. "Is that what you teach me? To run from bullies?" "Of course not, but you always tell me to stand up when something's wrong," she said. "That's what you're doing now, right?" I nodded slowly. "Then we shouldn't stop," she said with a certainty that belied her 12 years. "Not just for me, but for all the people he's hurting." In that moment, my daughter's courage strengthened my resolve. Richard had spent a lifetime causing pain without consequences. That needed to end not just for Grace and me, but for everyone in his destructive path. By mid-February, I had compiled enough evidence to warrant a serious conversation with my parents. I rehearsed what I would say, prepared a folder with the most compelling documentation, and even asked Diane to be available by phone if technical questions arose. I chose a Tuesday morning when Richard would be at a client meeting downtown. My mother seemed surprised when I called, requesting an urgent family discussion, but she agreed to have coffee ready. Their house looked the same as always, immaculate and formal family photos featuring Richard's achievements prominently displayed. My academic awards and Grace's artwork were notably absent. "This sounds serious," my father said after minimal pleasantries, checking his watch. "I have a board meeting at noon." I placed the folder on the coffee table between us. "It is serious. It's about Richard." My mother immediately stiffened. "If this is about Christmas, Hazel, it's time to move past it. Families have disagreements." "This isn't about Christmas," I replied, opening the folder. It's about what Richard is doing at the company. I laid out what I discovered: the inconsistent reports, the lifestyle beyond his means, the offshore accounts, the testimonies from colleagues. I presented everything methodically as I would to a design client, keeping emotion out of it. My father's face darkened as I spoke, but not for the reasons I expected. "You've been investigating your own brother," he demanded when I finished. "Hiring private detectives, approaching company employees. What were you thinking?" I was stunned. "Did you hear what I just said? Richard is likely embezzling from the company, your company." My mother began crying quietly. "Why are you trying to destroy this family? What has Richard ever done to deserve this? Besides emotionally abusing me my entire life, besides tormenting Grace, besides potentially committing financial crimes that could destroy the business you built." My father stood up, pacing the living room. "Some of these investment strategies are aggressive, yes, but Richard has explained them to me. He's innovating, taking calculated risks to keep us competitive." And the offshore accounts, I pressed. "The discrepancies in client statements, administrative issues," he said dismissively. "Growing pains from our digital transition." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You already knew." My father stopped pacing his silence, confirming my accusation. "You knew something was wrong, and you've been covering for him," I continued, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "I've been protecting the company," he corrected sharply. "And yes, protecting Richard too. He's made some mistakes, taken some shortcuts, but nothing that can't be corrected internally." "Shortcuts," I repeated incredulously. "Dad, this is fraud. People could lose their life savings. You could face criminal charges for covering it up." "That's enough," he shouted. "You have no idea the pressure Richard faces maintaining this firm's reputation. If some client accounts need to be balanced out with others to maintain overall growth, that's just financial reality." The front door opened before I could respond. Richard stood in the entryway, briefcase in hand, his meeting apparently concluded early or never scheduled at all. "What's going on?" he asked, though his smirk suggested he already knew. My mother rushed to him. "Hazel has been making horrible accusations. Hiring people to spy on you. Talking to your colleagues behind your back." Richard set down his briefcase and loosened his tie, the picture of calm concern. "I was afraid of this. Dr. Mercer warned me she might escalate." "Dr. Mercer?" I asked. "The family therapist I've been seeing," Richard explained smoothly. "To process my concerns about your increasingly erratic behavior since the divorce. The paranoia, the financial instability, the impact on Grace. The calculated nature of the lie took my breath away. He'd been laying groundwork, creating a narrative to discredit me before I even began investigating him." My father nodded as if this explained everything. "Richard has been worried about you, Hazel. We all have. But this," he gestured to my folder of evidence, "this vindictive campaign goes beyond family concern. This isn't about me," I insisted, my voice rising despite my determination to stay calm. "Look at the evidence." "Evidence gathered unethically, possibly illegally," Richard interjected. "Approaching my colleagues, having me followed. If anyone should be concerned about criminal liability, it's you." He turned to our parents with an expression of pained concern. "I've tried to protect her, shield her from consequences, but she's making it impossible." My mother was fully crying now. "Hazel, please stop this. You're tearing the family apart." I looked from face to face, my father's anger, my mother's distress, Richard's masterful performance of wounded innocence. They would never believe me. Richard had spent decades ensuring they never would. As I gathered my documents with shaking hands, Richard followed me to the door. When our parents couldn't see his face, his expression changed to one of pure malice. "They'll always choose me," he whispered. "They always have." I walked out without responding, my mind racing. In the car, I called Diane to update her on this devastating setback, wondering if we should abandon the investigation. As I was driving home, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Hazel, it's Jennifer, Richard's wife." Her voice was hushed, anxious. "We need to talk, but not over the phone. Can you meet me?" We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Cambridge, far from both our neighborhoods. Jennifer arrived wearing large sunglasses, despite the cloudy day, constantly checking the door as we spoke. "I've known something was wrong for years," she confessed. "Richard keeps separate accounts I don't have access to. He takes calls in the middle of the night. Sometimes he comes home with unexplained cash." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because of what he's doing to Grace," she said, removing her sunglasses to reveal a fading bruise around her left eye. "Children should be off limits. And because I'm afraid of what he might do next. Richard doesn't respond well to threats." Jennifer agreed to help me access Richard's home office during an upcoming business trip. She would forget to reset the alarm code, giving me a narrow window to search for documentation. For the first time, I felt hope. With actual company documents, we could approach the SEC, directly bypassing my father's willful blindness. 3 days later, Jennifer texted the all clear. Heart pounding, I slipped into Richard's house using the code she'd provided, heading straight to his home office. I photographed documents from his desk and downloaded files from his unlocked computer to a flash drive. I was nearly finished when my phone buzzed with a call from Grace. "Mom." Her voice was panicked. "Uncle Richard just pulled up in front of our apartment. He's pounding on the door." I froze, the blood draining from my face. "Don't open it. Go to Mrs. Kemp next door. Call 911 if he doesn't leave." I raced from Richard's house, calling him repeatedly as I drove. He finally answered as I was halfway home. "Looking for something at my house, Hazel." His voice was chillingly calm. "Jennifer told me everything." "Did you really think my own wife would betray me for you?" "Stay away from Grace," I demanded. "You should worry more about yourself," he replied. "You break into my house, steal private documents, harass my colleagues. I could have you arrested right now. What do you want, Richard? Stop the investigation. Destroy whatever you think you have. Or, the next time I visit Grace, it won't just be to deliver a warning." The threat hung between us, explicit despite its vagueness. I ended the call, hands shaking so badly I had to pull over. Jennifer had betrayed me, warning Richard instead of helping. Yet another person choosing Richard over doing what was right. But this time he had directly threatened Grace. And that was something I would never forgive or forget. March arrived with Richard's retaliation in full force. It began with small annoyances, appointments mysteriously canceled, emails going to spam folders, deliveries meant for my design business rerouted or lost. Then came the anonymous complaint to Child Protective Services. I arrived home from grocery shopping to find a CPS worker interviewing a terrified Grace about our living conditions. The allegations were absurd: neglect, exposure to dangerous individuals, unstable housing, but the investigation itself was traumatic. Though the case was quickly dismissed as unfounded, the message was clear: Richard could reach into any aspect of our lives. Within a week, 4 major clients canceled their contracts with my design firm. Each cited different reasons, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. My already precarious finances tipped toward crisis. Grace came home from school in tears one afternoon. "Everyone's saying you're crazy," she sobbed. "Tyler and Emma told everyone you attacked Uncle Richard and got arrested. They said we're going to be homeless." Tyler and Emma were Richard's children, my niece and nephew, both in the same middle school as Grace. They'd never been close with their cousin, but this targeted social warfare was new. "None of that is true," I assured Grace, holding her close. "Your uncle is trying to scare us into keeping quiet about what he's done." "Why doesn't he just leave us alone?" she asked, her voice small against my shoulder. I had no good answer. That weekend, I discovered my car's tires slashed in our apartment parking lot. 2 days later, we returned home to find the apartment door ajar, nothing stolen, but drawers left open. Papers disturbed a clear message that our space could be violated at will. I reported everything to the police, but Richard's country club membership included the police commissioner, and my concerns were politely but firmly minimized. Family disputes should be handled privately, one officer advised me. Without evidence connecting these incidents to your brother specifically, there's little we can do. As March progressed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking locks 3 times, jumping at unexpected sounds. Grace's therapist reported increasing anxiety symptoms. Our life was unraveling. I seriously considered giving up, destroying the evidence I'd gathered, perhaps even leaving Boston altogether. Grace needed stability, not this constant state of siege. It was in this moment of deepest doubt that an unexpected ally emerged. Nathan Carter had been one of my most reliable design clients until his sudden cancellation earlier that month. He called me directly asking to meet in person rather than discuss matters over the phone. I didn't want to cancel our contract, he confessed, when we met at a bustling cafe where conversation would be difficult to overhear. Your brother approached me at a Chamber of Commerce event. He knew details about my business loan applications, personal information that should have been confidential. The message was clear: drop your firm or face problems with my business financing. Nathan owned a small chain of eco-friendly office supply stores with expansion plans that depended on upcoming loan approvals. He couldn't risk his business, but he also couldn't stay silent about the intimidation. This isn't right, he said firmly. My father built his business facing actual mob tactics in the 70 seconds. I recognize intimidation when I see it. Nathan introduced me to Michelle Bennett, a lawyer specializing in financial crimes and whistleblower protections. Unlike the general practice attorney I'd initially consulted, Michelle immediately grasped the seriousness of what I'd uncovered. Your evidence suggests systematic securities fraud, she explained during our first meeting. The SEC would definitely be interested, but we need to approach this carefully. Your brother has resources and connections, and you're vulnerable right now. Michelle helped me understand protection measures, documenting every incident, installing security cameras at my apartment, creating secure communication channels, establishing emergency protocols for Grace. When I discovered surveillance equipment hidden in my apartment's smoke detectors, Michelle connected me with Kyle Rogers, a cybersecurity specialist who helped secure our digital environment and sweep for additional monitoring devices. Your brother isn't just intimidating you, Kyle observed after finding keylogger software on my laptop. He's genuinely afraid of what you might expose. For the first time, I realized Richard's escalating attacks weren't just about punishing me, they reflected his fear. I had something that threatened him, and that gave me power I hadn't recognized. Gradually, with Michelle and Kyle's guidance, I began to regain my footing. We established secure communication channels. We documented every incident meticulously. We installed cameras and alarm systems. We created emergency protocols for Grace. The immediate crises didn't stop, but I was no longer facing them alone and unprepared. I had begun to build a support network beyond Richard's sphere of influence, people who recognized the pattern of abuse and were willing to help confront it. One evening, as Grace and I were completing a security checklist Kyle had created, she looked at me with unexpected pride. "You're fighting back," she said simply. "Like you always taught me to do." In that moment, I realized something important. Grace wasn't just witnessing my struggle against Richard, she was learning from it. Every time I refused to be silenced or intimidated, I was teaching her what courage looked like. The path ahead remained daunting, but for the first time since Christmas, I felt something beyond fear and anger. I felt purpose. By early April, I had established a new strategy. If Richard's power came from isolating and discrediting me, then my counter would be building a coalition he couldn't easily dismiss. My first major ally came from an unexpected source. My older brother David had left the family 15 years ago after a massive falling out with our parents. He'd made periodic attempts to stay in touch with me, but Richard had always interfered, spreading rumors that David was unreliable, addicted to gambling, even mentally unstable. I'd allowed those characterizations to color my limited interactions with David, maintaining polite distance rather than real connection. Now I wondered if Richard had deliberately sabotaged that relationship too. I found David living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, just an hour away. He'd built a successful carpentry business, married, and had twin daughters a few years younger than Grace. Far from the chaotic life Richard had described, David had created the stability that had eluded me. I wondered if you'd ever see through Richard's act, David said, when I explained why I'd suddenly appeared on his doorstep. He drove me away by convincing Mom and Dad I'd stolen from Dad's wallet money Richard had taken himself. When they believed him without question, I realized I'd never win. David shared his own history of Richard's abuse, similar patterns of sabotage, gaslighting, and manipulation that had made his childhood a minefield of psychological traps. Richard can't stand anyone else having attention or success, David explained. He doesn't just want to win, he needs everyone else to lose. David introduced me to Rachel Martinez, an investigative reporter who specialized in financial fraud stories. She'd been trying to crack open corruption in Boston's financial sector for years, but had faced roadblocks with established firms like my father's. I need sources with first-hand knowledge, she explained when we met, and documentation that would stand up to scrutiny. If you're willing to go on record, this could be the break I've been looking for. Rachel helped me understand how to properly document evidence for potential legal and journalistic use. She explained which patterns in the financial records were most significant and how to present them effectively. As word cautiously spread through personal connections and encrypted communications, others affected by Richard began to reach out. Former colleagues who'd been pushed out after questioning practices, clients who'd seen unexpected losses in their portfolios, even social acquaintances who'd experienced Richard's vindictiveness after perceived slights. Each person shared a similar story: initial charm followed by manipulation, intimidation, and retaliation if they didn't comply with Richard's wishes. The pattern was so consistent, it was almost predictable. We began meeting as an informal alliance, sharing information and supporting each other through Richard's continuing campaigns of harassment. Michelle Bennett provided legal guidance, Rachel offered investigative expertise, Kyle secured our communications, and Nathan helped with financial logistics since my business was still suffering. David became a crucial support for Grace, offering her a safe place to stay when things became too intense at our apartment. His daughters quickly became the cousins Grace should have had all along. Our growing coalition gave me hope, but Richard soon discovered its existence. One evening, every member of our group received the same text message from an anonymous number: "Backing the wrong side will cost you everything. Last warning." Several allies immediately withdrew from our efforts. A former colleague suddenly received a job offer across the country. A client who'd been helping us document accounting discrepancies called to say he couldn't risk his retirement savings by continuing. Those who remained faced escalating pressure. Nathan's loan applications were suddenly flagged for irregularities. Kyle's cybersecurity firm lost a major contract. Rachel's editor received complaints about her unethical reporting practices. The most frightening incident came when David's car suffered brake failure on a winding coastal road. He survived with a broken arm and concussion, but the message was clear: Richard was willing to cause serious harm to maintain his position. The police finally began taking our concerns more seriously after David's accident. The investigating officer, Detective Sandra Morris, wasn't part of Richard's social circle and recognized the pattern of intimidation. "I can't prove your brother tampered with the brakes," she told us at the hospital. "But this goes beyond coincidence. I'm opening a formal investigation into the harassment claims." This official attention brought temporary relief. Richard's most aggressive tactics subsided, though the pressure continued in subtler forms. By late April, we had compiled an extensive dossier documenting Richard's financial crimes and pattern of harassment. Michelle believed we had enough to approach the SEC with a formal whistleblower complaint and potentially file criminal charges for the harassment and intimidation. Yet, as our case strengthened, my resolve occasionally faltered. A small fire in our apartment building officially ruled cause undetermined, but starting near our unit's electrical panel destroyed some of our evidence and forced Grace and me to temporarily move in with Michelle for safety. Each ally who suffered consequences because of our investigation weighed on my conscience. Was my pursuit of justice against Richard worth the collateral damage to so many lives? After David's accident, I seriously considered abandoning our efforts. Sitting beside his hospital bed, watching his wife Jennifer help him drink through a straw, the cost seemed too high. "I'm sorry," I told him, tears streaming down my face. "This is all because of me. I shouldn't have dragged you into this." David's response surprised me. "Richard has been hurting people unchecked for decades. If not you, who would finally stand up to him? If not now, when?" Later that evening, Grace sat with me in Michelle's guest room where we were staying. She'd been unusually quiet since the fire, and I worried the strain was becoming too much for her. "We could stop," I offered gently. "Move away, start fresh somewhere. Richard can't find us." Grace considered this seriously, her young face solemn in the lamplight. Then she shook her head. "Uncle David is right," she said firmly. "If we run away, Uncle Richard just keeps hurting more people. Mom, we can't let him win." Looking at my daughter's determined expression so much stronger than I felt in that moment, I found renewed purpose. Richard had spent a lifetime making others feel powerless. By standing against him, we were reclaiming that power not just for ourselves, but for everyone in his path. The next morning, I called our allies together. We would proceed with the next phase of our plan, a direct confrontation that would force Richard to reveal his true nature where it couldn't be denied. By early May, we were ready to implement what Michelle called our controlled demolition strategy. Rather than continuing to build our case in secret while enduring Richard's counterattacks, we would create a situation where he would effectively expose himself. The plan centered around a carefully orchestrated meeting. I would approach Richard under the pretense of surrender offering to destroy our evidence and cease our investigation in exchange for him leaving Grace and our allies alone. The location was crucial, a small conference room at a hotel where Kyle had already installed recording equipment. The timing was designed around Richard's psychology late Friday, when he'd be flushed with end-of-week success and potentially less guarded. Michelle had reservations. "He's too smart to incriminate himself on record," she warned. "He's smart," I agreed, "but he has a bigger weakness, his ego. Richard can't resist demonstrating his power when he thinks he's won." We prepared meticulously. I rehearsed conversation pathways to guide Richard toward admissions without explicit entrapment. Michelle arranged for an SEC investigator named Daniel Hawkins to be listening in from an adjacent room. Nathan convinced a sympathetic board member from Patterson Investment Group to participate as well. Most importantly, we established comprehensive safety protocols. Grace would be safely out of state with David and his family. Everyone involved had emergency contacts and extraction plans if things went wrong. The morning of our planned confrontation, I received a text from Richard Hurd, "You want to talk." My office, 4 p.m. He was attempting to change the location to his territory. I declined politely, suggesting the neutral hotel location instead. After some back and forth, he agreed his curiosity, apparently overcoming his caution. Walking into that hotel room was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Despite all our preparation, Richard had a lifetime of experience manipulating me. My hands trembled as I sat waiting. Richard arrived precisely on time, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His expression was a practiced blend of concern and condescension. "You look terrible, Hazel," he noted, taking the seat across from me. "This vendetta isn't good for your health." Or Grace's. The familiar mix of concern, trolling, and veiled threat steadied me somehow. This was the real Richard, always calculating, always seeking advantage. "That's why I wanted to meet," I said, keeping my voice deliberately weak, defeated. "This has gone too far. I'm worried about Grace's safety." Richard relaxed, visibly satisfaction crossing his features. "I've been saying that all along. Family conflicts should stay private. I want to propose a truce," I continued. "I'll destroy the evidence we've gathered. I'll tell my allies to stand down. In exchange, you leave Grace and me alone. No more harassment, no more threats. We go our separate ways." Richard studied me, looking for deception. "What about your crusade for justice? Your determination to expose me?" I looked down, feigning shame. "I can't afford justice anymore. You've made sure of that. I just want peace for my daughter. And your evidence. All of it. Everything. The financial records, the offshore account documentation, the witness statements. Gone." Richard leaned back, a smile spreading across his face. "I always knew you'd break eventually. You never had the stomach for real conflict, Hazel. Not as children, not now." I let his words wash over me, reminding myself of our strategy. Let him gloat. Let him reveal himself. "There's just one thing I don't understand," I said after a moment. "Why Grace? She's just a child." "Your niece." Richard scoffed. "Don't be naive. Children are leverage. When you started digging into my business, you put her in play." "Your business," I repeated carefully. "You mean the fraud? The client account manipulation?" "I mean the necessary adjustments to maintain profitability in a challenging market," he corrected smoothly. "Dad understands business requires flexibility. He's always understood that." "Is that why he's been covering for you?" "Out of understanding." Richard laughed. "Dad covers for me because he has no choice. The irregularities have his fingerprints, 2 documents he signed without reading client meetings where he made promises I had to get creative to fulfill. He's complicit whether he admits it to himself or not. I let silence stretch between us, encouraging him to fill it. Richard never could resist the opportunity to demonstrate his cleverness. The family business was failing when I took over client relationships. He continued, warming to his topic. Dad's generation of investors were dying off, and their children wanted higher returns with lower risk. Impossible demands. I found solutions. Solutions that involved stealing from some clients to pay others. He waved dismissively. Reallocation of resources. The net performance across the portfolio is what matters. Some accounts subsidize others temporarily. Eventually, it balances. And your personal accounts in the Caymans, how do they factor into this balance? A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he mastered it. Insurance. This industry is volatile. The smart ones always have a backup plan. At the expense of Dad's oldest friends, people who trusted the Patterson name. "Trust is for children and fools," Richard snapped his composure, cracking slightly. "Dad built a reputation. I built a system that actually works in today's market. His friends would have lost everything if I hadn't stepped in. They should thank me for the returns they did get. And the harassment, the threats having David's brakes tampered with, Was that part of your system too? Richard's eyes hardened. David should have stayed gone. You should have stayed in your lane. When people threaten what I've built, they accept the consequences. Even family, especially family, he hissed, leaning forward. You think I enjoyed growing up with a sanctimonious sister and a brother who could do no wrong just because he was born first. Dad was grooming David to take over until I made sure that wouldn't happen. The admission hung in the air between us. Richard seemed to realize he'd said too much. He straightened, adjusting his tie. Not that any of this matters now, he said, voice returning to its controlled smoothness. You're beaten, Hazel. You're going to destroy your so-called evidence and disappear back into your irrelevant little life. Because the alternative is watching Grace suffer the consequences of your poor judgment. The naked threat was exactly what we needed. I let my expression show real fear, not difficult given the circumstances. I need your guarantee, I pressed. In writing, that you'll leave us alone. Richard laughed. You're not in a position to make demands. But fine, I'll have my lawyer draft something suitably vague that gives you the reassurance you need. I nodded, then asked the key question we'd planned. And the company? Will you at least stop skimming from client accounts? Why would I? Richard shrugged. It's working perfectly. The system self-corrects. As long as new investments keep flowing in, everyone gets paid eventually. That's a Ponzi scheme, I pointed out quietly. Richard's face darkened with sudden rage. He stood looming over me. It's whatever I say it is. Do you have any idea what I'm capable of? I've built a financial fortress while you've been finger painting for scraps. I control everything, the company, our parents, this city's financial relationships. You are nothing. He was shouting now, decades of contempt pouring out. I could destroy you with one phone call. I've been patient, Hazel, far more patient than you deserve. But if you ever threaten what's mine again, the conference room door opened. Michelle entered, followed by SEC investigator Hawkins and the Patterson Investment Group board member. That won't be necessary, Mr. Patterson Hawkins said calmly. We've heard quite enough. Richard froze, comprehension dawning. He lunged across the table toward me, face contorted with fury. You set me up, you stupid bitch. His hands reached for my throat, but Michelle and Hawkins moved quickly, pulling him away. Hotel security alerted earlier to potential trouble rushed in to help restrain him. As Richard was handcuffed, still shouting threats and obscenities, I felt strangely calm. The performance was over. Richard had finally revealed his true self, where it couldn't be denied or explained away. Within hours, police added assault charges to the initial financial crimes allegations. News of Richard's arrest and the SEC investigation spread quickly through Boston's financial community. Richard made bail the following day but violated the terms of his release by attempting to access company servers remotely. Digital forensics later revealed he was trying to delete incriminating records. When authorities arrived to rearrest him, Richard was gone, along with several $1 million from accounts only he controlled. An international manhunt began focusing initially on the Cayman Islands, where his hidden accounts were based. I returned home to find my father waiting outside my apartment building. He looked aged beyond the few months since I'd last seen him. Shoulders slumped, face gray with shock and stress. The auditors are saying the company might not survive this, he said without preamble. 30 years of building something and it could all be gone because... He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Because Richard stole from your clients and you looked the other way, I finished for him. He flinched but didn't deny it. I never thought. I knew he was aggressive, but I believed him when he said everything balanced out in the end. You believed what was convenient, I corrected gently. Because it was Richard. My father looked at me properly then, perhaps for the first time in years. When did you become so strong? I always was, I replied. You just never noticed. Early June brought news that authorities had tracked Richard to our family's vacation property in coastal Maine, a secluded cabin on 20 acres of woodland that had been in my mother's family for generations. The property wasn't officially in Richard's name, which had allowed it to escape the asset freeze imposed after his disappearance. Local police were preparing to serve the arrest warrant when Richard contacted me directly. "I need to see you," he said without greeting when I answered the unknown number. "Alone. No police, no lawyers, no righteous big brother." "Why would I agree to that?" I asked, signaling Michelle, who was meeting with me to discuss upcoming testimony. "Because I have information that affects Grace's future," he replied. "About James. Things you should know." My ex-husband had remained mostly absent from Grace's life since the divorce, but the mention of his name in this context sent a chill through me. "This is another manipulation," I said firmly. "Whatever you think you know about James." "I know he's petitioning for full custody," Richard interrupted. "His lawyer filed the paperwork yesterday, citing your unstable behavior and involvement in criminal investigations as evidence you're an unfit mother." My blood ran cold. James had made occasional noises about wanting more time with Grace, but had never taken legal action. If he was moving for custody now, Richard's influence seemed the likely catalyst. One meeting, Richard continued, sensing my hesitation. "Then I'm gone for good. You'll never have to worry about me again." Against everyone's advice, Michelle's vehement objections, David's incredulity, Detective Morris's warning, I agreed to meet Richard at the main property. Not out of trust, but because this threat to Grace required direct confrontation. We established every possible precaution. I wore a concealed recording device. Michelle knew exactly where I was going and when. Detective Morris positioned officers within range of the property, but out of sight. I carried a panic button that would summon immediate help. None of these measures fully eased the knot of dread in my stomach as I drove the coastal highway toward the isolated cabin. The property looked the same as it had during childhood summers: weathered cedar shingles, wraparound porch, spectacular ocean view. In different circumstances, it would have been peaceful. Richard opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd been watching for my arrival. He looked different, unshaven hair longer than his usual precise-cut designer clothes, replaced by jeans and a flannel shirt. Only his eyes remained unchanged, calculating and cold. "No weapons," he said, holding his arms out. "You can check if you want." I stepped past him without responding. The cabin's interior was cluttered with evidence of hasty living takeout containers, unwashed dishes, clothes draped over furniture. "Going somewhere?" I asked, nodding toward a half-packed duffel bag on the sofa. Eventually, he acknowledged. "When things cool down. Some countries don't have extradition treaties." "Is that why you wanted to see me? To say goodbye?" Richard laughed, a hollow sound without humor. "I wanted you to see what you've done." The mighty Richard Patterson reduced to hiding in a cabin and eating cold pizza. "You did this to yourself," I replied evenly. "Every step of the way. Self-righteousness always was your specialty," he sneered. "Even as a kid, you had that holier-than-thou attitude. Did it ever occur to you that some of us had to fight for what we wanted? We all fought, Richard. You just couldn't stand for anyone else to win." Richard paced the small living room, tension radiating from his movements. "You want to know why I always came after you hardest? Because you were the only real threat. David was too straightforward, too easily pushed aside. But you watched and waited. You saw things." The admission was startling. All those years I'd felt invisible, powerless in our family dynamic, and Richard had perceived me as a threat. "What about James?" I asked, steering the conversation back to my concern. "You said he's filing for custody." Richard smiled thinly. "He might be. Or he might not. Does it matter? You came running at the mere possibility." The manipulation was so obvious, it was almost disappointing. That's what this is about. Proving you can still make me jump. It's about giving you a choice, Richard countered, his demeanor shifting to one of forced reasonableness. This can end today. I have offshore accounts the authorities don't know about. Enough to disappear permanently. But I need certain documents from the company's server, and I need the heat to die down. You're asking me to help you escape justice. I'm offering you peace, he corrected. I'll be gone, truly gone. No more threats, no more family drama. Grace grows up without this shadow hanging over her. All you have to do is create doubt about your testimony, suggest you might have misunderstood certain transactions. And if I refuse, Richard's artificial pleasantness vanished. Then I burn it all down. I'll tell investigators Dad knew everything from the beginning. I'll release emails showing Mom helped hide money. I'll make sure Grace spends the next decade in courtrooms and counseling offices. He leaned closer, voice dropping. You think you've won, but you haven't seen what winning costs yet. How do you think Grace will handle seeing her grandparents prosecuted? How will she feel, knowing she can't have normal relationships because everyone sees her as the daughter of the woman who destroyed the Patterson name? The threat was comprehensive and cruel, vintage Richard. But as he spoke, I realized something important. These were the desperate tactics of a cornered man. Richard's real power had always been his ability to operate in shadows to maintain plausible deniability. That was gone now. No, I said simply. Richard blinked, momentarily thrown by the direct refusal. You're not understanding the situation. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. You're offering me a devil's bargain because it's all you have left. But here's what you don't understand, Richard. I'm not afraid of you anymore. His face contorted with rage. You should be. He lunged forward, grabbing my shoulders. Do you think this ends with me? The company's finished. Dad's reputation is destroyed. Is that the victory you wanted? I didn't struggle against his grip. I never wanted victory. I wanted justice. For Grace, for David, for all the people you've hurt, including yourself. Something in my calm response seemed to enrage him further. With a wordless snarl, he shoved me backward. I stumbled, catching myself against the fireplace mantel. You self-righteous bitch, he growled, advancing toward me again. You've looked down on me our entire lives. Well, look at me now. As he reached for me again, sirens wailed in the distance. Richard froze head, turning toward the sound. You brought them, he accused, face paling. You were wearing a wire the whole time. The panic button in my pocket had done its job. As Richard processed this betrayal, his expression cycled through rage, disbelief, and finally a terrible emptiness. He lunged for the duffel bag, pulling out a handgun. My heart stuttered in fear, but Richard didn't point it at me. Instead, he held it loosely, contemplating it with an eerie detachment. Richard, I said carefully, think about what you're doing. Always thinking, he murmured, almost to himself. Always calculating the angles. Exhausting, really. The sirens grew louder. Richard glanced toward the windows, then back at the gun in his hand. Tell them I would have won, he said quietly. If the rules had been fair, I would have won. Before I could respond, Richard raised the gun to his temple. I lunged forward, screaming his name, but the shot cracked through the cabin as police vehicles skidded into the driveway. The next hours passed in a blur of paramedics, police statements, and shock. Richard had survived the bullet grazing rather than penetrating his skull, whether by chance or subconscious hesitation. He was transported to a secure medical facility, his legal troubles now compounded by the attempt to evade arrest. As I sat on the cabin's porch, steps a blanket around my shoulders despite the June warmth, Detective Morris brought me a cup of terrible police-issue coffee. You took one hell of a risk coming here alone, she observed, sitting beside me. I watched the crime scene technicians working inside the cabin, visible through the open door. I needed to see it through to the end. For all of us. Detective Morris nodded thoughtfully. Family cases are always the worst. But for what it's worth, you did good. Your brother's going away for a long time. The word brother caught in my consciousness. Despite everything, Richard was still my brother. We shared blood history, childhood memories, both good and bad. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a profound sadness for what could have been. Later that evening, after giving my formal statement, I returned to the hotel where my parents had been staying since the investigation became public. They had aged years and months, their comfortable world shattered by Richard's crimes and their own willful blindness. My father opened the door at my knock, his expression breaking when he saw me. For the first time in my adult life, he embraced me without reserve, his tears wetting my shoulder. He tried to. He couldn't finish the sentence. But he didn't, I said gently. He's alive. There's still a chance for healing eventually. My mother joined us, her face ravaged by grief, but her eyes clearer than I'd seen in years. We should have protected you, she whispered. Both of you. Instead, we enabled the worst in him. It wasn't a complete acknowledgement of their role, but it was a beginning. As we sat together in their hotel room, the weight of decades of family dysfunction hung between us, not resolved but finally painfully visible. The path to reconciliation would be long and uncertain, but for the first time it seemed possible that truth might create healing rather than deeper wounds. By September, the immediate legal storm had settled into more predictable patterns. Richard's trial concluded with multiple guilty verdicts: securities fraud, wire fraud, embezzlement assault, and attempted obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, with additional charges in several states still pending. I testified during both the trial and the sentencing hearing, describing not only the financial crimes I discovered, but the lifetime of emotional abuse that contextualized them. Speaking these truths in a public forum, having them acknowledged and validated by the legal system, provided a catharsis I hadn't expected. Richard maintained his composure throughout most of the proceedings, but when the judge delivered the sentence, something in him seemed to crumble visibly. For a brief moment, the armor of arrogance and manipulation fell away, revealing the wounded, frightened person beneath. I felt no triumph in that moment, only a complex sorrow for all that had been lost. The wider fallout continued to reshape our family landscape. My father had managed to salvage the investment firm by cooperating fully with investigators, bringing in outside auditors, and implementing strict new compliance protocols. The company survived, but in a diminished form that required his return from semi-retirement to rebuild client trust. My parents sold the family home too full of memories and too expensive to maintain, with the legal costs and client settlements draining their resources. They moved to a modest condo, a tangible symbol of how thoroughly their lives had changed. My mother entered therapy, finally confronting her role in enabling Richard's behavior throughout our childhood. Her progress came in fits and starts, sometimes acknowledging her failures, other times retreating into defensiveness or denial. But the pattern of automatic protection for Richard had been broken, creating space for a more honest relationship with her other children. Grace and I began carefully rebuilding connections with my parents. Sunday, dinners became a tentative tradition. Awkward at first, gradually warming as genuine conversations replaced performative family harmony. Grace approached this reconciliation with remarkable maturity, neither holding grudges nor forgetting the lessons of the past year. "They're trying," she observed after one such dinner. "Not always getting it right, but trying." My design business experienced an unexpected renaissance as the publicity surrounding the case brought new clients curious about the woman who had exposed one of Boston's most prominent financial frauds. I partnered with Nathan Carter on a campaign for his eco-friendly office supplies, merging our businesses in a collaboration that gradually evolved beyond the professional. David moved his family back to the Boston area, allowing our children to develop the cousin relationships they should have had all along. We established a weekly siblings-only dinner to rebuild our connection without the distorting influence of parental dynamics. I still can't believe we went 15 years barely speaking, David said during one such dinner. All because Richard convinced me you didn't want contact. He told me, "You resented me for staying connected to the family," I replied, the revelation still fresh enough to sting. "That you thought I was weak for maintaining ties." The extent of Richard's manipulation continued to unfold as David and I compared notes on our separate experiences. Each revelation brought grief for lost years but also strengthened our determination to reclaim our relationship. Grace prepared a school presentation on standing up to family bullying, carefully anonymized, but drawing on her experiences. Her teacher later told me it had prompted 3 other students to seek help for similar situations. "She has your courage," the teacher remarked during a parent conference, "and a wisdom beyond her years." In late September, Grace asked to visit Richard in prison. I hesitated, concerned about reopening wounds, but her therapist supported the idea as potentially providing closure. "I need to see him as just a person," Grace explained, "not as this scary monster who has power over us." The visit was brief and conducted under careful supervision. Richard appeared genuinely surprised that Grace had requested to see him. Their conversation remained tentative, neither accusatory nor falsely conciliatory. Grace didn't seek apologies or offer forgiveness. She simply reclaimed her right to define the encounter on her terms. Afterward, as we drove home, Grace seemed thoughtful. "He looks smaller," she finally said. "Not just because of the prison clothes. He just seems smaller." I understood what she meant. Richard's power had always been magnified by secrecy and manipulation. Exposed to daylight separated from his carefully constructed persona, he became simply a flawed, damaged human being. That recognition marked a turning point in my own healing journey. I began a support group for survivors of family financial abuse, discovering that Richard's pattern of behavior, using money as a tool for control and punishment, was sadly common. The group grew beyond my expectations, creating connections between people who had previously suffered in isolation. Some participants later testified before state legislators, considering enhanced penalties for financial exploitation within families. As the holiday season approached again, I found myself facing the anniversary of the moment that had catalyzed our family's painful transformation. The prospect of another Christmas gathering brought understandable anxiety, but Grace surprised me by suggesting we host dinner at our apartment. "We can make new traditions," she proposed, "ones that don't have all that old baggage attached." In preparation, Grace created a new handmade gift, a photo collage commemorating positive moments from the difficult year. David's family welcomed my parents' gradual steps toward accountability, the support network that had sustained us through the crisis. As our smaller, humbler family gathering unfolded, I found myself reflecting on all we had lost and gained. The illusion of a perfect family had been shattered, but in its place, we were building something more authentic. The path had been unimaginably painful, but the destination, truth, accountability, genuine connection proved worth the journey. Family should be where we find our greatest safety, not where we're most vulnerable to harm. That simple truth had guided me through the darkest moments of confronting Richard's abuse. It wasn't about punishment or revenge, but about creating boundaries that protected those I loved, including, finally, myself. The future remained uncertain in many ways. Richard would eventually be released. Financial repercussions would continue for years. Family healing would progress in unpredictable patterns. But the shadow that had darkened our lives for so long had been named and faced diminishing its power over us. As Grace proudly displayed her new creation to appreciative family members, I caught David's eye across the room. His slight nod conveyed what words couldn't: acknowledgement of how far we'd come and commitment to the journey still ahead. What was your experience with family dynamics growing up? Did you ever have to stand up to a difficult family member? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share so others know they're not alone in these challenging family situations. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak the truth even when your voice shakes. Wishing you strength and healing in your own family journeys.